Good morning. Welcome to the Austin chapter of Reasons to Believe. I'm so glad that you're joining us at home and with the officers and volunteers that we have here in location. Please bow with me as we open this gathering in a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this wonderful, beautiful Saturday, this weekend that we can relax and take some time off and enjoy learning more and more about you and contemplating a possible eternal existence with you. Please be with our speaker, Dr. Bradley, today as he conveys the truth of the research that as he will elaborate, we are more and more beginning to hear about in the national media, even outside of the religious circles. It's getting more and more attention. Please be with us as we listen to this. Help us to be receptive to this message and for us to think about it and contemplate it and hopefully be able to communicate this to other members of our community and family members as well as people that we work with. And all these things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. So again, thank you so much for joining us on this Saturday for our Austin chapter gathering. My name is John Murphy. I currently serve as the president of the Austin chapter. And so I'd like to run through just a few announcements real quick before Dr. Bradley goes through his presentation. So last month we had Dr. John Franklin Lane who spoke, and the presentation was on the power of testimony. And if you did not hear his testimony, you really missed something. It is a story that I guarantee you will never forget. Lacey and I had the pleasure of being able to have dinner with him and his wife after the meeting and giving a further insight into his life and his background. And what a tremendous story that he has to tell. And so that is currently on our Austin YouTube channel, our Austin chapter YouTube channel. And so just a reminder that all of the presentations during this pandemic have been recorded and are now available on our channel, and would encourage you to go back and look at some of the past presentations. So next month, we're going to have Dr. Rob Wilson come and speak to us. So Dr. Bradley is speaking today. Dr. Sarah Salviander spoke last year. She's going to be speaking this coming September. And now Dr. Rob Wilson is going to be speaking in June. One thing that all three of those have in common is that they are members of our Austin chapter. We are so blessed to have such gifted, scholarly, credentialed speakers who are members and who are willing to present and give us live scholarly presentations. And so next month, again, we'll get to enjoy Dr. Rob Wilson speaking, and he's going to be talking about an introduction to biblical apologetics. A lot of our membership is very familiar with apologetics, and they're very interested in the topic, and that's why they come to our gatherings. Well, he's going to talk a little bit more about why we should defend our faith and how we should do so winsomely, with gentleness and respect. So I would encourage you to mark your calendars for June the 12th, the second Saturday in June. And then in July, Dan Britton is going to be speaking to us. He's going to be talking about the culture shift that we're presently witnessing in the United States. And there's a lot of polarization that is currently being attached to this culture shift. And so he's going to give us a little bit of a background of how we got here, and then also talk about how as Christians we can navigate these waters. I believe that he was just recently promoted to the National Director of Apologetics. I can't remember the name of the organization off the top of my head, but again, another member we're very thankful to have as a part of our chapter. And then in August, Bob Davis is going to speak to us. He's going to be talking about the implications of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and he's going to be talking about the narrative before the scrolls and how a lot of people talked about how the Bible had been corrupted over years. There are several religions that are based on this premise, and then how that has changed with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so again, we'll talk more about him in August. But also a reminder that in August we're going to go back to our live chapter gatherings. So we're going to be meeting at the Longhorn for Christ campus on the University of Texas. And so mark your calendars to please come and join us. Our masking policy is not yet set. We're going to be waiting to see what the City of Austin guidelines are at that time. I'm hoping that it's going to be optional. I hope that most of our people are vaccinated by that time. But again, we'll follow whatever the City of Austin's guidelines are, and that'll be posted. And we'll make sure that everybody knows that beforehand. So please mark your calendars. So if you have any questions, this is a live broadcast, and so we are going to have a Q&A following this. Please send those in to Reasons TB Austin. Reasons TB stands for to believe. Reasons TB Austin at yahoo.com. Feel free to send those in as the presentation is ongoing, or at the end you can send them in, and we'll be asking questions from our listeners for Dr. Bradley to answer and address, as well as if you would have an interest in his slides, including the videos in the slides. We would be happy to email you those, if you'll just send us an email requesting those at the end of the presentation. So again, today we're so thankful to have Dr. Bradley speak to us. We're so blessed that he's a member of our chapter, that he's retired here in the Georgetown area after a long career. He's been a professor at Texas A&M University and then also Baylor University, where he retired from. He became a member of our church here at Main Street Baptist Church, and it was very interesting because when the pastor introduced him as joining our congregation, he introduced Dr. Walter Bradley, one of the people responsible for writing the Bible, which was funny because he was actually referring to the Apologetic Study Bible, in which Dr. Bradley had contributed an article or two in that Bible. And if you don't have the Apologetic Study Bible, I would highly recommend that you have that as a part of your library. It's a fantastic supplement to the regular Bible, as a fantastic study Bible. So the subject that Dr. Bradley is going to be talking about is one that he has been heavily researching the last 3 years. He's been invited internationally to give talks on this subject, as well as to other universities and churches. And so at this time, we'd like to welcome Dr. Bradley to our Austin gathering. Please give him a warm round of welcome.
Thanks, John. Well, good morning. It's fun to be here on a Saturday morning, and it was in a way not nice. It was nice not to have to drive all the way to downtown Austin, to where we would usually meet. Although it would have been more fun speaking to people. I'm not very accustomed to speaking in this kind of a technology, and so you'll have to bear with me as I'm kind of learning as I go. Some years ago, about the time the wall in Germany fell down, and the whole Russian Empire began to crumble, I had the opportunity to go over there and to give some talks basically on high performance graphite epoxy composite materials, which is my research area, at some of their most prestigious research centers and universities. While I was there, though, I had the opportunity also to share some about my Christian faith, and it was through that 20 years later, God introduced me to this topic. John Burke, many of you know him, one of the pastors at a large church in Austin, Gateway, was there working with Campus Crusade, and when the wall came tumbling down, many Christian groups, including Campus Crusade, had taken the opportunity then to go and share the gospel where they had not previously been able to do so. And John had made some arrangements for me to be able to speak at some of these prestigious places. It was a wonderful experience. Wasn't sure what the reception would be, but the people were very open and very curious. They'd been told all their life there wasn't a God by the communists, but then everything else the communists had told them was wrong. And so they had now doubted everything, including they were doubting their doubts, right? Fast forward 15 years later, John Burke calls me up on the phone. I haven't seen him since we were together in Russia. We had recently moved to Sun City, and he had contacted me to see if I would be willing to read a manuscript that he was just finishing. He wanted me to read it. He was very clear, not as a Christian. I want you to read it as a scientist. He said, I want to know if after you read this, you feel like you can provide an endorsement for the book. not based on your Christian faith, but based on your understanding of is this sound science or not. And I thought, that sounded like a really interesting project. I was really hoping it did have a lot of good science in it, because I would have felt really bad saying, John, sorry, this really doesn't have enough science to be worth it, But no, he had done an amazing job. I think he spent 20 years, John Burke, working on the book, which became Imagine Heaven. It became a bestseller. The first 2 months it was out, it sold, I think, 500,000 copies. It was number 7 on the New York Times best books, or whatever they have where they keep track of these things. And so it was through that I initially got interested in this, but after reading John's book, I became much more broadly interested, and I was surprised. This is 2015, and there was almost no public acknowledgement of this as being some kind of a legitimate intellectual curiosity. And there had been a couple of simple movies that had been made about this, but there was very, very little. I was surprised. I had never even heard of the term near-death experience. This is 6 years ago. And how much has changed in these last 6 years is remarkable, because as I'll be sharing with you some videos today, it's mainstream media secular, because it's really that interesting. I think everybody, whether they're a Christian or not, has a curiosity about what happens when we die. It's one of those topics that we all wonder about sooner or later. I live in Sun City, and almost everybody in Sun City is curious about what happens when you die, because we're all in the age that that's not sort of in the distant future. It's maybe sooner than we think. One of the things that I have thought a lot about over the last few years was a relationship that I had a very good friend of mine, Carl Erdman, at Texas A&M. He was the associate dean. He was a terrific guy, very high integrity, a very warm, friendly guy. And though he was an atheist and I was a Christian, we got to be very good friends working together and had a good mutual, respectful relationship. When he died, I went to his funeral, and it was interesting for me being at that funeral to hear the things that were shared, and to give me a rather, what I consider to be real understanding of what atheistic funerals are like. They don't talk about heaven. They don't talk about being reunited with their family in the future. They just talk about memories. Because as far as they're concerned, and it was very clear in this particular funeral, here's a guy that was a terrific guy, but the legacy that he was going to have was strictly going to be in people's memory, because he didn't exist anymore. And it made a real impact on me, because I never really thought that carefully about how much difference does it make what you believe in this area. And to go to a funeral of somebody who was a wonderful guy, had lots of friends, did a lot of nice things, and then to find out that he doesn't exist anymore, and that his funeral in that way was very depressing. Okay, I'm doing my own slide. I was getting ready to say, next slide. If you were to die tonight, would you cease to exist? In the example I just gave you, the answer would be what? When you die, you cease to exist. That's it. You no longer have any existence whatsoever. Would you no longer have a consciousness? Well, of course, if you believed as Carl Erdman did, you would say, no, Carl Erdman doesn't exist anymore. He was here for a time, and now he no longer exists. It was really interesting what Billy Graham said about a year and a half ago when he died, that it was very, very, I thought, telling. He said, now, I'm going to die soon, and when I die, the newspapers are going to all say, Billy Graham has died. And he said, don't believe it. He said, I'm going to be in a much better place. I'm going to be more alive than I have ever been in my whole life. And I thought it was so interesting. He said, so don't believe all the stuff they're going to put in the newspapers when they say Billy Graham has died. I'm going to be more alive than I've ever been, and I'm going to be in a better place than I've ever been. I thought that was a wonderful testimony for him to have shortly before he died. And I imagine many people sort of remembered that when they read his epitaph and heard that he had died, they said, Billy Graham's not dead. In spite of what the newspapers say, in spite of what the TV said, Billy Graham is more alive than he's ever been, and he's at a better place than he's ever been. Now, the question that we're going to be considering today is there any empirical evidence, or I should say sufficient empirical evidence, that can give us a compelling answer to this critical question? I think we would, as Christians, choose to believe, we have chosen to believe that there is a God, there is an afterlife, and we believe that by faith, but I think it would be nice to know that that faith is rooted in facts. As we study the Gospels, like the Gospel of John, he makes it very clear that Jesus performed many signs that provide what I consider to be rational evidence for the existence of a God, that Christ being God incarnate, and that when we die, we too are not going to cease to exist. We're simply going to exist in a different way. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Is that just a pipe dream? Is it just a sort of a faith belief that people who don't know better have? Or is it really something that can be substantiated with what I would call empirical evidence? Obviously, I can take many things by faith, but I certainly appreciate the fact that much of the claims of the Bible are rooted in what I consider to be very strong empirical evidence, in factual things that can say, I'm not just believing this by blind faith, I'm believing it because God has provided overwhelming and clear evidence of his existence, as well as his love and concern for us. When we talk about heaven, we need to make a distinction as we get started in our discussions this morning. I think a lot of times people talk about heaven as a place that we might go to immediately when we die. But in fact, I think the Bible certainly indicates in different passages that there is a heaven. But then the question is, when Jesus comes again, is that a place that already exists that's going to somehow be replaced? Or is it something that doesn't yet exist? In a book by Randy Alcorn, which I highly recommend, called Heaven, it's probably the most comprehensive presentation of what the Bible teaches us about heaven and the future that we all have to look forward to it. In his book, he makes an interesting distinction, which, having been a Christian for 60 years, I'd never thought of, or 55 years, I'd never thought of. And his distinction was this. He said that when we die today, the question is, where do we go? The heaven that's talked about in Revelation's last 3 chapters is talking about a heaven that's going to happen when? It's going to be when Christ returns. And so what I think of as the eternal heaven that we're going to exist in only comes into being at the time when Christ returns. And there'll be a new heaven, a new earth, and so forth and so on. So the question is, what happens to us when we die today? Okay, what happens when we die today? Well, in his book, he says we should think, the Bible presents, I think, ideas that clearly point to what I would call an intermediate heaven. And that's exactly what Randy Alcorn calls it, intermediate heaven. He says that whenever we die, we're going to go to someplace, but it's not the heaven that's going to be our permanent place of existence. The permanent place of existence described at the end of Revelations only happens at the end of history of humanity when Christ returns. And in the meantime, question is, where are we going to be? Now, if you read Philippians chapter 1, it has some interesting verses. One of them says, what? To be absent from the body is to be where? Present with the Lord. The question is, where is that? When we're talking about being present with the Lord, present where? Because the heaven that we're going to be living in eternity is going to only be put in place when Christ returns. There's other verses that give similar kinds of indications. What can you think of? Any ideas? Nope. Not a fair question. Hang on just a second. Yeah, in Luke chapter 23, Jesus is talking to the person that's crucified beside him. One of them kind of renounced him. The other one embraced him. And what did Jesus say? This day you shall be with me in paradise. Okay, so there's a place that we're going to be if we die that's not going to be our ultimate place, which only is put into place when Jesus comes at the end of the human history. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. This was always the verse that was a mystery to me, because when you read this, it's Paul talking about it, and he says, there once was a man, and then he starts talking in third person, but in fact he's talking about himself, who found himself being taken up to third heaven. Do you remember that passage? And they say all kinds of wonderful and amazing things that he'd never seen before, and so forth. Now, when I say taken up into third heaven, he's not talking, he was physically taken up there. He was actually taken up there, his spirit, to see things that he had never seen before, and would ultimately see maybe in the future. But he makes a lot of interesting claims there, and I'd always kind of wondered, what in the world is he talking about? Sounds like he's had a few too many drinks or something. Acts 14 talks about Paul being stoned. And in that particular case, again, we get the sense that that heaven is something that exists now, but it doesn't exist in the way that we will experience it for eternity. So in his book, Randy Alcorn calls this intermediate heaven. So I want to begin by making the distinction then. The things that we're going to be talking about today do not have anything to do with what is being discussed in in Revelations. It has everything to do with what happens when we die today. Between now and when Christ comes again, there's a new heaven, a new earth, and so forth. And that's what Randy Alcorn calls imagined heaven. I'm sorry, he just calls it, intermediate heaven, not imagined heaven. After Jesus' resurrection, then, next slide. Yeah. Next slide. Yeah. 3 key empirical questions that I wanted to discuss today, empirical questions. Do human beings have a body and a spirit/soul? I simply mean dualistic character, or just a body? Will I still be conscious immediately after the death of my body? What is the intermediate heaven like? How could we possibly find out? These are the questions we're going to be exploring, because I think as a Christian and somebody who works as a scientist as well, I'm happy to take by faith what the Bible teaches, but I'm also curious to see if the things that the Bible teaches have a counterpart that confirms those in some way, not necessarily completely. We have faith in there that will give us, I think, even more foundation, particularly when we're talking to people who don't necessarily have the Christian faith or believe even that there's a God. And God has left lots of evidence to help confirm the faith that He has called us to. Do human beings have a body or a spirit/soul? This is a key question, because the atheist would argue that you have, as my friend Carl Ardman would say, that when you die, your body ceases to exist and you cease to exist. Now, the Christian view of this is obviously different, because it says we have a body, but that body is a dwelling place for a soul. One of the analogies that I like to try to think about this is that if I were a pianist and I had a piano and something happened to my piano, it broke down, it disappeared, because it didn't function anymore. I don't cease to exist. The piano can die, so to speak. Its existence can be ended, but not mine. That the evidence of this is becoming more and more clear, that we have an existence that is included with our piano. That's our way of communicating and expressing ourselves. It's the way we interact with our surroundings in a physical way, because our surroundings are physical. But at the end of the day, I have a soul that exists, and whether my body continues or not does not change the status of my soul, but it will change the condition of it. So, will I still be conscious when I physically die? The answer, I think, is yes. That's what Billy Graham was saying. To be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. We'll be more alive than we've ever been. What is the intermediate heaven going to be like, and how could we find out? Seems like that it would be impossible to know anything about intermediate heaven, because the Bible doesn't say very much about that. When the Bible talks about heaven as a place, it's talking almost exclusively about where we're going to be at the end of history, when we have the permanent heaven rather than the intermediate place. And it happens then that we need to be able to make that distinction and keep it clear. What is intermediate heaven going to be like? The only way you could possibly answer that question is to go there. Now, we might think that that's actually impossible, because to go there you would have to first die. And if you die and then you go there, we don't normally think of people dying and coming back. Interestingly enough, that happened almost never before 1960. And what happened in 1960, which is quite remarkable, was new technologies and techniques had been developed to do resuscitations, so that people who had died physically, and when we talk about die medically, we're talking about what? No more heartbeat, no more breathing. What else? Brainwaves, yeah. Those three things. When you're in the hospital, in the emergency room, all three of those are being monitored. And when they all go flatline, then the person is what we call clinically dead. But with the techniques that were developing in the early 60s, all of a sudden, they figured out some ways that you could take somebody that was clinically dead and you could actually work on them and cause them to be resuscitated and come back to life. Now, as time began to pass and they were doing this more and more, they began to get doctors some really pretty crazy seeming stories from the people who were dying and then being resuscitated. And as these people would come back with these amazing stories of, for example, being in the operating room, overseeing what was going on, and they could tell the doctors everything that happened while they were clinically dead. Pretty amazing. They could even tell the doctors kind of funny things about doctors who weren't dressed properly, doctors who used bad language, and so forth and so on. Things that you couldn't know unless you were conscious, but these were things that happened while they were clinically dead. So this was the beginning of, I think, a whole new interesting opportunity for God to allow us to see things. But he also allows people, when they have near-death experiences, in some cases, and not all cases, to actually go on a journey in their spirit body. Their physical body is on the operating table and it's clinically dead, but the spirit is quite alive. As I said a few minutes ago, my physical body can die, much like my piano can break down, but that doesn't mean I don't exist. It simply means my body doesn't function anymore, or as my piano maybe quit functioning. But I'm still as alive as I've ever been. When they have these opportunities, they have these so-called out-of-body experiences, and not everybody who dies has an out-of-body experience. But it happens relatively common. It's not that unusual. There's interesting story in John Burke's book about a group of people that were having dinner together talking about it, and these were people that were heart surgeons. And there was a lady that was there that was talking about these near-death experiences, and she said she was telling them about all these amazing things that happen when people have out-of-body experiences. And the doctors were all saying, well, I've never, ever had one patient that ever had that happen. And I've done 200 or 300 surgeries. And so she made a simple suggestion. Why don't you start asking your patients if they had anything odd happen during this operation? And much to their surprise, quite a few of the people, the percentages weren't like 100%, but the significant percentage of them said, oh, yeah, I had these amazing things happen. And then they would go on and on about, well, and then the doctors, still being skeptical, would say, well, maybe they're making this up. So then they would ask about things that had happened in the operating room. And they could tell you everything that happened in the operating room. Clearly, while they were dead, they were, as they claimed, hovering over what was going on in the operating room and can give you excellent details of everything that took place that you could not know if you were dead during that time period. Now, that's not the most interesting thing. When these people have these near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences, the near-death and out-of-body, you can have near-death and not necessarily have an out-of-body experience, is that many of them find themselves going through a tunnel of light and on the other end coming out at a place that is remarkable in every way and is a place where we're going what is referred to as intermediate heaven. When they get there, everything, well, I can hardly describe it, but the words that they describe what it's like is so amazing when we think of heaven being wonderful and amazing in ways that we've never seen here and probably can't imagine. And they have these wonderful, wonderful experiences. In most cases, they have opportunities also to meet Jesus. In some cases, to have life reviews. All of these things are for them life-changing. There is a place beyond which they can't go, so-called point of no return, or what I like to think of as God doesn't let you go to heaven and return, but he allows you to go to the front porch of heaven. And you can get a sense of what it's going to be like, and you can be a messenger going back. If you watch the videos on people who share testimonies about this, they have really interesting and sometimes funny stories to tell about how when they got to intermediate heaven, then Jesus said, now it's time to go back, and you've got things, unfinished business you need to take care of. They would say, no, I don't want to go back. I don't want to never leave this place. And Jesus says, sorry, you got to go. There was a funny one by a lady who was a back surgeon at University of Southern California Medical School. And she said she actually argued with Jesus about going back because she really didn't want to go back. She had some reasons why. But she said, I'm not a very good lawyer. I'm a doctor. And I lost the argument. But in any case, I think the main point here is that as Christians, and this is what we're going to call intermediate heaven. Intermediate heaven is that place where if I physically die today, I will be, until Christ comes again, does a new heaven and a new earth, our permanent place of being for eternity, in which case then we would be able to move to that. But it's exciting to know that when we die, we don't cease to exist. And to me, this is a very, very important point, because we believe that we are not just physical bodies. We believe we were embodied spirits. And that's a very, very different deal, because my spirit never dies. My spirit is going to live on for eternity. It's my physical body that can experience death. And intermediate heaven then is the place that I hang out, if I can use that term, until Christ comes again, and the permanent place that God's preparing for us, that Jesus will prepare for us, is available. Next slide.
So before we had the news of Aretha Franklin's passing, we had planned
I'm
this
supposed
show.
to be doing slides. Yeah, sorry.
So before we had the news of Aretha Franklin's passing, we had planned this show on what happens after we die. And as we mourn the Queen of Soul, it seems a particularly good time to ask, is there something more? Something on the other side? Today's show tries to answer those questions. My first guest, Sherry Amay, was rushed to the hospital after weeks of feeling short of breath. Just 10 minutes after she arrived, she flatlined in her husband's arms. Sherry was dead for 90 minutes, but miraculously came back to life and now has a profound near-death experience to share. Watch. In early 2008, Sherry Amay was living life to the fullest.
I really was living a really wonderful life in my 20s, making good money, experiencing freedom, and really feeling on top of the world.
Sherry's good life came to a halt later that year when she was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma.
He waited till the door was closed, we both sat down, and I knew like something was up. And that's when he looked at me and he said, "You have cancer."
She immediately underwent 4 intensive rounds of chemotherapy, crippling her body.
There's no words to describe what that chemotherapy treatment was like. It was so extreme. I would not wish those side effects on anybody.
After battling the disease for 3 months, her cancer went into remission and she was declared cancer-free.
It's an incredible feeling to go in for those tests and realize they're saying it's shrinking.
But in April of 2010, Sherry suffered another setback, cardiac arrest.
The doctors were rushed in. They immediately performed CPR. Within the first 5-10 minutes, they were unsuccessful and were ready to call my time of death.
One doctor ordered CPR to continue.
He just turned into a drill sergeant and he told everybody what to do. They did chest compressions for over 90 minutes, still without success.
She was put on life support, then rushed to New York Presbyterian Columbia Hospital and underwent open heart surgery.
I knew I was somewhere else. I knew I had died. I would say instantaneously, when I flatlined, I immediately crossed over into this other realm. And I remember my body just floating in like this white space. And I felt as light as a feather. I felt free.
Sherry joins us now. Sherry, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So can we... Let's go to that moment in the hospital where you were flatlining, and they say that that's the moment you are dead if your heart is not working, if your heart is not pumping. Is it true that they wanted to stop CPR, and it was the one doctor who said, "Mm-mm"?
Yeah, they were ready to call my time of death. Everybody in that staff, in that room, in the emergency room, they were ready to call my time of death. One man in that entire room said, "No, we're not losing her," and ordered everybody like a drill sergeant, according to my father, to continue with CPR. And what they had to do was continue it long enough for him to actually install temporary life support.
What is the first memory you have of, your otherworldly experience?
Yeah, it was pretty instantaneous for me. I remember 1 minute being in this world, and the next minute being like, I died. I knew immediately. I was in this white space where I felt like I was formless, and I felt light as a feather. I felt free. And I remember feeling really free of the burdens of everyday life.
Was there a feeling of panic at all? Like I've died. Oh my God, I've died.
It was more, wow, this is so beautiful.
Really?
Yeah,
You remember that?
absolutely.
And was it one of those things where you were above the room? Like, where were you seeing?
It wasn't like an out-of-body experience. I literally was in a whole other realm. So I was no longer in the physical hospital room. I was completely in another realm. I actually felt connected to my family on the other side, and I felt connected to the heavens. So there was no distinction of, okay, I'm dead and I'm in this other world. It was more, I just gracefully walked through this door and made this beautiful transition into another realm.
So there's much more to her experience and what happened in those moments, including an illumination on the life she had lived thus far. We're going to pick it up there when we come back. I'm back now with Sherry Amay, who says she had a life-changing near-death experience during cardiac arrest when she was dead for 90 minutes. So, Sherry, I know you said that in the moment, it felt like you did a life review. What does that mean?
Yeah, it's funny because it actually wasn't just a life review of my current life. It was actually a life review of any experience my soul had ever undergone. So, which is so crazy. It was so crazy to me.
Did you believe in past lives prior to that moment?
I didn't think anything. I really didn't even know what a near-death experience was until I got back. So this was all very foreign to me. I had heard maybe of people that had had an out-of-body experience. I did not know what this meant. So yeah, I mean, this was definitely very, very foreign for me.
And do you feel like you got a window into prior lives?
Absolutely. I mean, the biggest thing that I really learned was sometimes we all have like this common reoccurring theme that's happening in our lives, whether it's, poor finances or relationship trouble. I got to learn during my lifetime reviews what that common theme was and actually how to clear it.
Wow.
Because what had happened was it was attaching to my soul during every lifetime.
I'm sorry, but I believe that. I feel like that's part of karma.
Yes.
And that you keep getting the chance to get it right.
Yes.
And eventually, hopefully you do, and you move on to the next plane.
Yes.
But I really think there's something to that.
Yeah.
The notion of being dead but not dead is confusing to people. And we have a doctor here. His name is Dr. Sam Parnia, a world expert on the science of death and the author of Erasing Death, which sounds like a great idea. Doc,
of course.
Thank you for being here. So
Pleasure.
How could she be dead but not dead for 90 minutes?
Well, it's a very good question, of course. The reality is that we all have a perception of death. And this goes back millennia, which is essentially that death is a moment. There's a time when you're either alive or you're dead. And the reason we think that is because when the heart stops, you have no more blood flowing into your brain, into your other organs. The brain shuts down immediately. A person becomes lifeless, motionless, and they are dead. Or even if you go back to the French Revolution, if somebody had lost their head, there's no more blood getting into the brain and it shuts. However, what's amazing is that about 50, 60 years ago, we discovered CPR, and we found that actually you can artificially restart the heart or produce a circulation, get blood flowing around the body even after a person has died. And that made our definitions more ambiguous. And what is now even more interesting is that we understand that it's only after a person has died, which makes perfect sense, that the cells inside the body start to undergo their own process of death. So when somebody's heart stops, it's only then that the cells will start to die, and that process takes many hours, possibly days.
How has your outlook on death and life changed as a result of this experience?
I am definitely no longer afraid of death. And that was something that I had feared my entire life.
Yeah.
And what I learned is that that fear of death really prevents you from truly living. And so if you were to know me prior to my near-death experience and now, it's like I'm two completely different people, because I lived pre-near-death, I lived my life very, all my decisions were like based around fear. Fear of what other people thought, fear of what other people would say, fear of not being good enough, or fear of being unworthy. Even though I was successful in my earlier years, every decision was still based upon that. Now I flipped the script. I'm doing everything.
I love that. I completely believe in that. I think if you're making decisions out of fear in general, you're making them out of the wrong place. I'm so glad you're well. And you've got your new heart.
Yes.
You look amazing, and thank you for telling your story to us. All the best to you.
Okay, we've got a second video somebody sharing a near-death experience.
We are talking today about near-death experiences, and now we have the story of Nancy Rines. Nancy grew up in a Midwestern Catholic family, but distanced herself from the church and for years considered herself an atheist. But in 2014, something happened that made Nancy reevaluate her faith. We will meet her in a minute, but first, some of Nancy's story.
It was January 3rd of 2014. I'll never forget that morning. It was a beautiful sunny day. I decided to go out on a bike ride. I needed to do some errands around town. There was a little voice inside of me that just said to not go out riding that day. I don't know where that came from, but I ignored it. I got about a mile, well, not quite a mile from my home, and I could see some traffic coming in on the right. At the very last minute, I realized that first car wasn't going to stop. I knew in a flash that I was going to die right there. It was a woman driving a big SUV, and she hit me broadside. I put my hand out like this to try to veer off my bike the other direction. I ended up flipping onto the top of her hood and looked in. I think she was so focused on her phone that she didn't know that she had hit anything or anyone. So I ended up pinned between her vehicle and the road as she drove. As my shoulder hit the pavement and my body hit the pavement, I had an interesting thing happen. I had what I call a sense of dual consciousness. Me underneath the vehicle, being dragged under this vehicle. But at the same time, I saw the whole accident unfold from a position of 50 to 75 feet outside of everything. I see myself laying under the vehicle in pain, in screaming. I saw a woman struggling to hang on to life.
Nancy Rines wrote about her story in her book, Awakenings from the Light, 12 Life Lessons from a Near-Death Experience. Welcome, Nancy. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
So that moment you described as dual consciousness, was your heart still beating? Were you still alive in that moment?
I was still alive in that moment. That's why it really kind of freaked me out a little bit. I hadn't had any, I had never felt anything like that before. There was nothing in my lexicon to describe what this was. But I was still alive, yes.
And it was unfortunately, it was only a preview of what was to come.
Right.
Because 3 days later, you had a major surgery.
Right.
And what happened?
So during the surgery, my heart rate stopped for a brief time, and my breathing went to zero. My blood pressure dropped precipitously. And it was in that moment that I found myself waking up. And I thought, wow, this is great, because around me was this beautiful hillside, surrounded by flowers and trees and a beautiful mountain range in the distance. And a sense of peace and love and welcoming that I had never felt before. And I knew something was different.
And like with Sherry, it wasn't panic, it wasn't fear,
No.
It wasn't scary.
No, not at all. No, I felt a little confused at first, and then I thought to myself, I must have died. I wonder if I died. But then if I did, why am I here? Because I don't believe in any of this.
Right, I'm an atheist. What's happening? Could it be I was wrong?
Exactly.
And what about that? Because you came back.
Right.
And what information did you take away from that? What lesson?
Well, I was welcomed in to heaven, what I call heaven, immediately. When I had that thought of, I wonder if I died, and if I did, why am I here? There was a welcoming voice that said, because you are my child. This is your home. Welcome home.
Was there hesitation about returning back
For
here?
me, yes.
Like you might have just stayed there.
There was a part of me that really wanted to stay because of the peace and the love. The love was incredible, and the connection to everyone and everything was incredible. I was connected not only to my family here on earth, but also to everyone else in that place.
So what made you come back?
what made me come back was that I had agreed to do this before I was born. And I was reminded of that while I was there.
That you had more business left to finish.
Right. And I said there was at some point a womanly guide came and kind of helped me out. And I said to her, I don't remember agreeing to do this. And so she showed me on this kind of a screen in the sky of me standing in front of all of my family and friends, agreeing to do certain things, and this was one of them.
Do you live your life differently now as a result?
Completely differently.
How?
I actually take a lot more risks.
That's similar.
Not in a bad, like, put my body in danger way, but I realize that, again, I don't want to let fear run my life. I'm much more loving.
Much more loving.
Incredibly. My capacity for love has increased multiple times. I mean, just an incredible amount of love for everyone and everything. And I'm at peace. I live every day from a state of peace and love and joy.
And faith?
And faith, definitely.
Faith,
that changed almost immediately.
I'll bet.
Yeah.
Wow. So glad you're well.
Me too.
And here to tell us a story and
Me
to
too.
finish your important business.
Thank you.
Interesting testimonies. Some of them have things that are not always sure that they have their theology exactly right, but they obviously are having an encounter with God that's very profound, and then it points them in the right direction where they probably can straighten some of these things out. It makes me think having a near-death experience wouldn't be an altogether bad deal, right? If you could have the kind of experience these people are having that are really life-changing. We get to have that eventually, if not immediately. Okay, let's talk about data and talk a little bit more about kind of how do we evaluate this from a scientific point of view. Again, when John Burke asked me to review his book, one of my concerns was it would make a lot of claims, but it didn't have a lot of data, and it really wasn't something you could make claims that had any scientific substance to them. And I was pleasantly surprised when I read his manuscript, and that kind of opened the door for beginning to explore this much, much bigger area and finding out that, that there's a ton of data that's very, very compelling. We have two kinds of data that we get. One kind of data is going to happen in the emergency room. The other kind of data is going to be something that happens in what we'll call the front porch of heaven, okay? Now, I call it the front porch because it's made very clear with everybody who has one of these experiences, if they're going to go back, then they don't get to come in. They get to be on the front porch, okay? That's all I can say it's analogous to. They get to see Jesus. They get a sense of what heaven's going to be like. They come back profoundly changed. There's an interesting example of this. People in Holland, there's some doctors from Holland who got involved in this and now have been researching it. Holland's a pretty secular country. I think they have 27% of the people have any belief in a God. It's pretty much an atheistic culture. But of the people who have had near-death experiences, they have continued from that point forward to have a very vibrant faith 25 years later. So the changes that they're experiencing are not changes that are, I had one-time big experience with going to heaven or whatever it turned out to be. But no, it's profound in the way that it's life-changing for the rest of their lives. And it's interesting. In a country where the culture is very atheistic, that people have had these kinds of opportunities to have a personal encounter with Jesus, find it to be life-changing permanently, not just temporarily. Okay, emergency room data is one kind of data. The other kind of data is front porch data. Well, let's look at both of these. Emergency room data has what? Heart monitoring, brainwave monitoring, breathing monitoring. So we know when people were alive. We know when they were dead. And we can then also combine that with the stories that they have to tell about what happened. And it can become very, very compelling that they had a real experience, not just of dying, but actually their soul or their spirit going someplace. Journeys to the front porch of intermediate heaven or hell. Most of the people say they don't all have the same experience, but they have similar experiences in that they went down a path or they went through a tunnel. They had lights at the end. At the end of the lights, they came into this beautiful opening with, when they describe the landscaping and all that, it's much, much more beautiful than anything we see here on earth, although there are beautiful places here. It's overwhelming. There's a sense of peace there that people feel like whatever concerns and worries they have just completely disappear. And in general, I don't think this happens to everybody. They have an encounter with Jesus, and what does Jesus do? Well, he loves them, and he makes them feel like he's they're one of his children. But he also does a life review. And I had not ever heard that term before, although maybe I'd come across it as something that happens after you die, but not in this context. And in the life review, what they do is that God, in a sense, runs something that's like a very, very fast video of your life. And one of the things that happens when you see that, you see things that you never noticed at the time. And some of the examples are, let's say when you were a teenager and maybe you did something kind of mean to some other guy or girl in your class. And maybe that person was struggling at that time. And maybe what you did was to contribute in a significant way to their feeling like they were being excluded or rejected or whatever. So you could see the negative of things that maybe we think are inconsequential because they weren't consequential to us, but they were very consequential to the people that were hurt or injured by that. And then on the positive side, to be able to see things that maybe we did that didn't seem that consequential, but it made a huge positive difference in the life of the person. And if you see in your whole life, sometimes we think there's not much going on, but there's sometimes a lot more going on than we realize. And a lot of the things that we think are not a big deal, either for good or for bad, end up being a very big deal to the people who we're interacting with. And I think, I don't know if I'd say people without exception, but everybody who has had one of these near-death experiences and comes back ends up feeling like their lives have been profoundly changed because they see it in the way that God allowed them to see it. And it made a huge difference then in how they lived going forward. And almost everybody that has one of these shares that same kind of, it's life-changing because our eyes are open to things that we don't necessarily see. Another thing that's kind of interesting is that we meet on these near-death experiences, and I say we, I haven't gone, but in the near-death experiences, people who are relatives, people who you maybe are family relatives, but not somebody that you actually knew. In the movie Heaven is for Real, I think that was the name of it, the little boy that had a near-death experience when he was like 5 years old, he was having an operation, and he died for a time in the emergency room and then was resuscitated. And when he came back, he was telling his parents that he had met his sister. And they said, "But you don't have a sister." And he said, "Yeah, I met her when I was in heaven." And I think they're all kind of puzzled. And then it dawns on him, how old is she? What did she look like? It turned out that the mother had had a miscarriage. And the miscarriage, sometimes I don't know what we think about that. I have one miscarried child in my daughter's family. And it turns out that they don't cease to exist. They don't die. When you have a spirit put in a body, it's permanent, it's eternal. So I look forward, when I get to heaven, in meeting my one grandchild that I don't have. I have 7 that I know. But I just thought that was interesting. Then he also was saying the little boy was saying he met his grandfather. And they said, doesn't seem reasonable the grandfather had actually died before the little boy was born. So they got a bunch of pictures out of the grandfather, and they showed him pictures of the grandfather that had been taken in the last 10 or so years before he died. And the little boy said he didn't look like that, he didn't look like that, no, not like that. And so they just kind of decided, didn't know what to think about it. Well, about a year later, they were looking through some family albums that were older family albums, and they're open to a page, and he said, "Look, there's my grandfather, there he is." Well, it turned out it was a picture of the grandfather when he was about 30 years old, and he looked so different than when he was, the pictures that he'd been taken, the little boy had seen previously, that he didn't recognize him. Now, I thought that was very comforting, because I'd like to think when I go to heaven, I'll get to look like I'm 30 instead of 80, right? So heaven's going to have all kinds of nice surprises. But okay, so emergency room data, we get data from front porches, and a lot of things people discover you couldn't know in a different way. There's so many good examples, but let me share one. There's a lady who is 20 years old. She's been blind from birth. She's driving in a taxi cab with somebody, and they have a car wreck. Now, she was blind from birth. She has never seen anything, not even what she looks like. So, next thing she knows, she becomes aware that she's someplace, and it turns out that she's in a emergency room in a hospital, and there's a bunch of doctors and nurses all around working on the lady and frantically trying to resuscitate her, but she doesn't realize it's her, because she had never seen herself, and she had no reason to think that I need to be in the hospital being resuscitated. I'm doing just fine. After watching this for a time, it dawned on her that that must be me. How did she figure that out? She had a very unusual ring with a very unusual kind of a piece on it. And she also had very long hair that went down to about the middle of her back. And it soon dawned on her that she was looking at herself. Now, what was exciting was in her spirit body, she wasn't blind. It was just in her physical body that she was blind. And so for that brief period of time, she had an opportunity to see at least that one time. Whenever she was resuscitated, her spirit re-entered her physical body, her home, so to speak, and she continued to be blind for the rest of her, until she was interviewed for this book, I guess. But it was just kind of interesting to think you could be in a situation like that where they're doing something trying to resuscitate a person, and you don't even realize it's you until you have a chance to check it out. Okay, here are a bunch of other cases, but I think we're running a little bit too slow on time. Y'all aren't listening fast enough. No, I'm kidding. But let me see. There's probably several of these I've already talked about. But I think one of the most interesting ones is of the guy who had a massive heart attack. I'm at the bottom one. And when he was being resuscitated, they pulled out his false teeth, and so his mouthpiece. He was, of course, unconscious when that happened, and they took it and they stuck it in a drawer in one of these little cart things that they have in the hospitals. And after the operation, he remained unconscious for 7 days. When he woke up, he was in a different room, of course. He had no idea of where the little cart wasn't there, but he had no idea of where his false teeth were. And so he asked one of the nurses if they would get the false teeth, and they said they didn't have any idea of where they would be either, because they have lots of little carts like that around. Well, he was able to describe exactly what the cart looked like and exactly where in the cart with multiple drawers they would find it. They went, and sure enough, they found it. Now, How could he have that information? He was absolutely flatlined during that time. And yet a lot of things happen that are sort of a little bit beyond what we can understand with our regular medicine. But I think it's a good example of we can be physically dead, but our spirit is still well alive and apparently quite aware of what's going on around. Kind of an exciting, interesting possibility. Okay, what kind of documents are available for studying near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences? Let me mention one that I would highly recommend to you. The University of Virginia has had a center to study near-death experiences for about 30 years. They got into this long before it became sort of fashionable and popular and interesting today. And they have lots of stuff at their website. All you need to do to find this location, because I did it this morning because I didn't remember what the address was, I simply put in University of Virginia near-death experiences, and it popped right up. It has one summary page that at the beginning of the website that tells you what they call near-death experiences at a glance. What is a near-death experience? Near-death experiences occur when someone has limited brain function, yet is able to have a sensory experience without full use of their physical senses. 2, how can subjective experiences be studied? Since near-death experiences often happen in hospital settings with professional medical oversight, thousands have been sufficiently well documented for scientific study. I think there's a repository of over 3,500 of these, not all at this place, but I think where they pool their information. Third, what are some peer-reviewed studies? Collectively, these 4 studies examine the experiences of over 3,500 patients. And then the 4th comment, aren't these experiences just physical reactions? Near-death experiences are not a physical reaction. The study by Sam Parnia concluded that non-physical explanations do not account for visual awareness, clarity of thought, and positive emotions. And then the 5th, what does it all mean? The most conservative interpretation of near-death experiences is that some aspect of human consciousness is non-physical and continues after physical death. We call this the soul. That's pretty good coming from a well-known secular university. Okay, let's see. Okay. What kinds of other documents are available? Amazon lists many books that are either describe near-death or out-of-body experiences. Keep in mind, people do have near-death experiences in a higher rate. Only a subset of those become out-of-body experiments. You can have a experience in an operating room, for example, where your heartbeat stops, your breathing stops, but then you're resuscitated and you don't have any recollection of that. So that would be a near-death experience not accompanied by an out-of-body experience. I don't think you can do it the other way. Okay, databases contain 3,500 carefully documented of these from people of many cultures, races, religions, non-religious, or atheistic beliefs, ages ranging from 4 to 80, and from many different educational backgrounds. It is estimated that 3 to 4% of Americans have had a near-death experience, but not always an out-of-body experience. Gallup poll, that's from a Gallup poll, interestingly enough. You can check out your YouTube or Google, and you will find a tremendous amount of stuff. I was happy, and I only discovered this just looking for some new interesting things for this presentation, that Megyn Kelly has her, I guess, weekday program on NBC News, and it turns out that several of the other major news networks also have been doing specials on near-death experiences. 5 years ago, there was no information out there, and in 5 short years, this thing has become extraordinarily interesting. And I think it's gained a significant amount of credibility just because the evidence is so overwhelming. Here's some other outlets where you can get information. BBC did a documentary. Christmas is the day after Christmas in 2015. I happened to see that by accident. It was Christmas and we were at home, and somehow one of the U.S. outlets that worked with BBC had that. And so here in England, which is very secular, they were running a full-hour documentary, very well done, and it wasn't propaganda either for or against. It just provided a huge amount of interesting information, interviewing people who'd had near-death experiences, and having them tell their stories, having the doctors that were involved in their whole experience accompanying it, and it's very, very well done. New York Times, I don't normally think of New York Times as being very sympathetic toward anything having to do with theism, much less Christianity. But they ran a featured article in 2016 called A New Vision for Dreams of the Dying, Experiences of Dying People. Now, this is different than what I've been talking about. They're talking about what happens to people during the time that they are in process of dying. We often think of you died at this point in time, but many people, as they are going through this process, can tell you a story that goes with that. What kind of a story? I think that people, as they're having this experience, will have what some people call a welcoming party. Now, who might the welcome party be? You're laying in the hospital, you're on the verge of dying, and lo and behold, your parents show up. Or maybe if you have a child who had died ahead of you, shows up. This happens more often than you would imagine, and it's what people call it, your welcoming party to heaven. I taught a course like this for a whole 5 classes at Seniors University. There were 2 ladies there who worked in hospice, and so they were around a lot of people as they were dying as hospice workers. And they came up after one of the classes where we talked about this, and they said, this is not unusual at all. It's not widely publicized because the people who are experiencing it are going on to their future. I assume these are people that are going to heaven. I'm not sure if people who are going to hell have somebody to come to visit or not. The people that I have talked to personally are all people who are Christians, and they are Christians from their family or friends or whatever who had preceded them in death and came to reassure them, and in a way, maybe even to go with them in this transition. I rather like the way that sounded, and I think it provides some interesting evidence. Now, the fact that the New York Times did this, you can be sure they looked at it really carefully because they're not particularly in the business of enhancing or supporting theism. But I think this is becoming so common. In the past, people didn't have as many of these kinds of experience because before the technology we had, when people died, they probably died more often pretty abruptly. But I think most of our medical technology today does a lot to maybe extend slightly life and make it more comfortable. So the opportunities to have this are much bigger than they used to be. National Geographic had a cover story. I can't remember if it was cover or, sometimes they have a main and then a second one in April of 2016. Newsweek magazine had a big article in 2018. The whole idea of near-death experiences and people having a spirit that can exist without their bodies is becoming very, very well documented in all of the things that are becoming mainline.
This is a really fascinating story. Do you believe in life after death? Our next guest was a highly respected neurosurgeon and atheist when he had a near-death experience and says he went to heaven and met God. Dr. Eben Alexander joins us now live from Charlottesville in Virginia. Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
Now, tell us briefly about your incredible experience in 2008.
It all happened 6 years ago. I went suddenly into coma over about 3 hours. Went into deep coma from a rare bacterial meningitis, the worst kind you can have, called a gram-negative. And it kept me there for 7 days. I was on a ventilator the whole time. When I first got to the hospital, had about a 10% chance of survival. By the end of those 7 days, down to a 2% chance with no chance of recovery. And it was a few hours after that I started coming back to this world. But when I did, my brain was ravaged. I had no words, no language, had no idea who the family members standing around the bedside were, but I knew where I had just been, and that's what I tell the story of in Proof of Heaven. Words and language came back over hours, days, childhood memories over weeks, and all of my 20 years experience in neurosurgery came back over about 8 weeks.
Doctor, you went to heaven. You saw God. So, what is heaven like, and what's God like?
Well, it's very hard to put into words. I explain in the book how I started out in a primitive earthworm eye view, very coarse, unresponsive realm, which I think in retrospect was the best consciousness my brain could muster when it was soaking in pus and the neocortex, the human part of the brain, was being destroyed. But then I was rescued from that by a slowly spinning white light into a beautiful, ultra-real, idyllic valley filled with life and growing plants with butterflies, sparkling pools of water, angelic choirs up above, emanating tremendous, awesome, and joy and beauty in these incredible anthems, chants, and hymns that came down from above, and then ascended up beyond that into realms beyond all time and space, all described in detail in Proof of Heaven, and now Map of Heaven goes into much more detail about the scientific aspects of my journey.
And Doctor, can I ask, and you obviously know more about this than I do being a neurosurgeon, but how do you know you weren't just dreaming? How do you know it wasn't just an hallucination? And also, given that it was a near-death experience, to get to heaven, aren't you meant to actually die?
Yes, exactly. And I think that's why the scientific community, the medical community, takes my story so seriously, because of the nature of my illness. Severe gram-negative bacterial meningitis drove me into coma within 3.5 hours. Any doctor who takes care of such patients, when they see the details of my medical records, see the scans, all the lab values, neurologic exams, they realize my neocortex, the human part of the brain, had been horribly damaged by this meningitis. So there was really no way to explain it as brain-based, even though that's how I spent the first month or two, was trying to explain it because it was way too real to be real. I wanted to explain it as a hallucination or drug effect or dream. But in fact, none of those explanations work because of the damage to my neocortex.
If we understand that all humans from all races and all belief systems can go to heaven if they're good people, does it strike you as interesting that the experience you had was such a Christian interpretation of the afterlife?
Well, actually, no. It's much more of a universal. I came to realize that my journey rang very true for Kabbalists, for Jewish mystics, for Islamic mystics, Sufis, Christian mystics, Buddhists, Hindus. This is a very common tale, and that's what I share in the Map of Heaven, is how all these stories going back thousands of years have a tremendous resonance with each other, and that is really the power behind this. Has everything to do with our understanding of consciousness, and that's where the book Map of Heaven goes into so much detail, especially around the enigma of quantum mechanics and what is called the hard problem of consciousness, which is basically that no neuroscientist on earth can give you the first sentence about how the physical brain creates consciousness, and it's because it does not. It's a reducing valve or filter that limits pre-existing consciousness down to the tiny little trickle of the apparent here and now. And that's what I go into in Map of Heaven to show that this is where the science is going, is a realization that consciousness is not produced by the physical brain. Wow. And this is where it gets very interesting. And within the next decade, all of science will be going in this direction. I'm simply pointing the way towards that.
It's a fascinating story, and thank you so much for sharing it with us today. Thank you, Dr. Alexander.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
A little bit of background about him. He is a heart surgeon from Harvard Medical School, where he worked in their medical program as a doctor for I don't know how many years, 15 or so years, and was a very, very outspoken atheist. And I think early on, poo-pooed a lot of even the near-death experiences, kinds of things that were beginning to be publicized. I find it interesting then that he ends up having his own 90-minute long near-death experience, which literally scared the hell out of him. And I just think he's one of the big persons who travels around the country telling his own story. And of course, as a doctor, he can tell it with a lot of details that make it even more compelling. Let me flip through these. We're running out of time. I recommend all these books. And there's a lot more out there. Okay, two key questions raised by near-death experiences or out-of-body experiences. Can the mind, the spirit, the soul, consciousness exist apart from the brain? Is there consciousness after, conscious life after death? Now, one of the key distinctions between what theists and atheists believe is that we believe that we are embodied spirits. That is, as I said before, my body can die, but I do not cease to exist. I exist in a spirit form and not in a material form, but nevertheless, I have a very real existence. And I think that the atheist has to say, as I shared at the very beginning with the story of my friend who had a funeral, when you die, you're just a body. Everything that happens is in your brain, and when your brain dies, you cease to exist. Now, one of the things that I think is worth keeping in mind is that when you have such a view as that, then I think it really makes us too one-dimensional. I think that the brain does, in fact, function. It has a function, but its function is to do what? It's very much like my computer. And my soul or my spirit is sort of like the software that runs everything, that controls everything. So the spirit can make use of the physical body as a way of communicating and experiencing sort of a kind of a life. But in fact, if something happens to the computer, well, maybe the analogy is breaking down now. Let me move on. Okay. Two key questions rise from near-death experiences. Can the mind, spirit, soul, consciousness exist apart from the brain? And I think the conclusion of the people at the University of Virginia who've been studying this for 30 years with a big research team, not one person, they have a center, very well funded, and they argue very persuasively that it's almost impossible to imagine that we're only a brain without a spirit or of some kind. Materialists or atheists say this is impossible, but many scientists who were previously skeptical now believe that the evidence validating near-death experiences is compelling and provides a substantial basis to support the hypothesis that the mind or the soul can exist apart from the brain. monism versus dualism. I think Christians are dualists. We believe in that we aren't just a body, that we're a body that has a soul in place, or spirit, however you want to say it. My body, as I said earlier in an analogy, is like a piano. My soul is the pianist. My spirit expresses itself in the physical world via my body, but it can exist apart from it. Okay, what are the hypotheses of scientifically skeptical people? Near-death experiences are the result of physical changes in a stressed or dying brain caused by, okay, again, they're saying your brain's where everything is, and there isn't a real you. Your brain is your real you. Too little oxygen or too much carbon dioxide, imperfect anesthesia. They've got a bunch of hypotheses here, but all of them have been clearly demonstrated to be not true. So these are all kind of people grasping at, trying to find something. George Masur at the University of Michigan, self-proclaimed materialist, speculates that spikes in the neural activity like those in dying rats might create hallucinations that could be experienced as near-death experiences. But this is speculation with no data to confirm it. Also, do we really think that rats have a soul or a spirit? If not, what could studying rats tell us about our existence beyond our physical life? Who gets the burden of proof? It's interesting as you read criticism sometimes of near-death experience work that's been done, not just by Christians, but by any scientist. And they always say, well, but it could be this, it might be that. And I think what they're doing is they're assuming they don't make any kind of a rational, positive, empirical case for near-death experiences happening in a purely material way, with the brain ultimately being controlling everything. The brain doesn't do that. It does a lot of good stuff, but it's not the control. My brain doesn't make decisions. It informs the decisions that I make. Materialists often assume that it is up to those who believe in the near-death experiences to provide perfect experimental evidence before they can be believed. Absence of perfect experimental evidence of the out-of-body experience does not equal to evidence for or proof of out-of-body experiences that they don't occur. Can materialists experimentally prove that the out-of-body experience did not occur while the person was brain dead? No, not a chance. We should look at the preponderance of experimental evidence to see what hypothesis seems most likely to be true based on what we know today. I think I'm going to skip through these for sake of time so that we can have some Q&A. And I think when this is posted, all of this will be posted. So you'll have an opportunity to see the last couple of slides. Let me apologize for running too long. I know the mind can only absorb what the seat can endure, and I'm almost certain I've exceeded that limit, but should we do a stretch break just?
Well, first of all, thank you so much. Are you finished? Are you ready for Q&A?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. I think the length of the presentation really demonstrates the amount of research that there is out there that you would like to offer. But thank you very much for this. And so with the time, we just have time for a few questions, and we would like to get to those. So I'll start with a question we received from the audience. So what happens to a believer who suffered from dementia before their death? Do they regain their memories? If so, is it instantaneous, or will they only regain those memories when they have been resurrected and given their glorified body?
You know, I don't have a clear answer, but I'll have a reasonable guess. I feel sure that whatever limitations we have in our physical bodies will, and dementia is, well, I don't know enough about dementia to know what the sort of root causes are. But I would assume that when we get our resurrection bodies, when Christ comes again, that we'll be made full. In the meantime, I would be surprised if it wasn't the same. That I think God can do whatever he chooses. And my sense is that whatever limitations we have in this physical existence will be remedied when we are a spirit, okay?
Okay.
A soul. I'm not
Okay.
sure. I'm not sure how dementia affects my soul. I know how it affects my brain.
Right.
And I think dementia would, to me, be like a computer that's the programming's gotten screwed up somehow, and it doesn't.
So once your soul is released from the mechanical defects of your brain, then it should be instantaneous, right? That you would
Correct.
have
Yeah.
those memories. Okay.
Yeah,
Very
that's
good.
speculation, but I think it's
Sure.
reasonable.
So one of the things you'll notice when people talk about these near-death experiences, they all constantly talk about heaven and how wonderful it is and how glorious it is. And as you talked about maybe being on the porch of heaven, do any people who have near-death experiences ever talk about having a less wonderful experience, perhaps a more hellacious type of
Yeah.
experience, a nightmare, if you will?
When I was flipping through slides, I missed one that I should have stopped on, and it had to do with that. 27% of people who've had near-death experiences have very bad experiences, okay? In John Burke's book, he has 2 people in there that are basically atheists, if I remember right, and one of them, in his near-death experience, he literally went to hell, and it scared the hell out of him. And he actually, when he came back, and he'd been an atheist for a long time. His experience was he went to the front porch of hell, not the front porch of heaven, and it really caused him to absolutely make a huge change. When he came back, his wife was so upset with him because she's an atheist that they ended up getting a divorce. He left his job at the University of Kentucky. He was a professor to become a minister. And so I would say that going to hell did scare the hell out of him. Now, the 27% number is too low. And the reason is two reasons. One reason would be when we have traumatic experiences that are bad, our mind often, okay, and I'm not sure if that's in the brain or in the software, suppresses those. And so people who have really, really bad experiences, often when they recover consciousness, they don't look back and remember what happened, okay? Because it's kind of maybe a protective device that the body and mind has that we can suppress some of these kinds of things that would be very traumatic. But some examples are, for example, when doctors have been working in the emergency room, they may have a situation where somebody who is unconscious becomes conscious and is saying, help me, they're coming to get me, they're coming to get me. And then they go flatline again. And then maybe a little bit later, when they come to, they're going, help me, they're coming to get me, they're coming to get me. And when the operation was over and the lady recovered from her anesthesia, and the doctors asked her what was going on with you that you kept saying, help me, they're coming to get me. And she said, I have no idea of what you're talking about. And so I do think in some cases, if it's a really traumatic, negative experience, we may or may not remember it. But there are 27% that remember it and are willing to talk about it. I suspect there's also, in the 27% would be higher, some people have had that experience, but they don't want to talk about it. And so, but because it wouldn't surprise me if probably half the people that have these kind of experiences are not necessarily Christians.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
But I think if they weren't, this would probably push them to start thinking about it more seriously, because I think people who aren't Christians think this is life, is all there is, kind of like the people we were talking about at the beginning, who think it's just my brain, and when I die, I cease to exist.
So in the videos that we watched, as a little bit of background maybe to this question, you mentioned that one of the musings might have been theologically questionable, if you will. Mm-hmm. Also, in one of the videos, the host talked about how I think it was Dr. Alexander, that he had a Christian interpretation, was the word she used, of his dream. This question is, do people from other cultures and other religions see a biblically oriented heaven and God when they have an NDE? So someone who normally would not be a Christian, but then they have a near-death experience, and it has very Christian overtones.
The studies that have been done, that I have seen, indicate that most people have a similar experience, that it's not culturally dependent, okay? I think that their understanding or interpretation of that might be different, okay? Because but I think in God's providence, He would be able to come, if His purpose is to try to reveal Himself to people that are at a critical fork in the road, so to speak, then He would do that in some appropriate way. But I think most of the people, I've not read a bunch of these, but the ones that I have read almost always talk about something that sounds like a Christian experience, in that the person who they meet is somebody in a white robe and a very bright glowing light around, and people from whatever their background is, religious, cultural, age-wise, they seem to have more or less the same experience. Now, that would make sense to me, because I think in some of these other religions, they don't even have the vision of a personal God. And so I'm not sure if it was going to be, what would they expect? I think probably some of them wouldn't expect anything, certainly not anything that looks like Jesus, in a white robe and with a lot of bright, beautiful animation around. So I think that the differences are fairly minor. I think that for the central experience is much more common to everybody. And my suspicion would be that if somebody had that kind of an experience, that encounter would also stimulate them when they went back, when they were resuscitated, to go and find out more about that.
Okay, excellent. So due to time, we're going to just have this one last question. And you touched upon it just briefly in the presentation, but I think it's a good one to end on for you to elaborate further. So I think for the skeptic or the atheist who has a materialist ideology, as you mentioned, I believe on one of your slides, they believe that perhaps this is a firing of the neurons that's taking place, that's implanting a memory, similar to the way that when we're sleeping we have dreams, we wake up and we have this vision, we have this memory. They might argue that when we're clinically dead, that the neurons still can implant these vivid dreams, these vivid imaginations, and when we wake up, we're just simply recalling this materialist implantation. So I guess my question would be, how would you argue that that is not a satisfactory description of the phenomena that's actually occurring?
Well, the first argument I would have was, show me your data. Okay? This is nothing but speculation. But there's a technical reason why I think it's also, excuse me, is also not true. And that is that when people have these kinds of experiences, the people that they encounter when they have their near-death experiences, and they always have a welcoming, I guess everybody will have somebody there to welcome them, even if they weren't very friendly, because everybody who has one of these says there was a welcoming party of relatives or friends or whatever. Now, if that were going to happen, it's pretty hard to imagine how everybody's brain produces their own personal welcoming committee when their brains, it seems to me rather ridiculous, because there are what I think of as features of this that are very specific to that person's. It's not just neurons, okay? and that somehow in the storage and the memories and so forth, the very fact that they would have something like that where people are coming to greet me and, oh my gosh, a bunch of neurons just got together to look like Aunt John and Uncle Joe, and they came and they talked to me. How can you do that with random neurons? You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Random neurons might make a noise, but the idea that it would recreate important people from my life in some accidental way, to me seems preposterous. And I think those ideas, I've seen those mentioned in some of the technical literature, but they're usually poopy-doo too. I don't think that's not a broadly accepted hypothesis, much less evidence.
Is poopy-doo a technical scientific term that?
It is, but you have to be an advanced student to be getting into the poopy-doo area, because it requires more advanced training and high IQ and all that.
Very good, very good. Just a reminder to our audience that if you would like a copy of the slides that also contains those videos, please send in an email to reasonstbaustin@yahoo.com. We'd be happy to send those to you. Dr. Bradley, thank you so much for coming and sharing your wealth of knowledge and your research.
Thank
we
you.
Greatly appreciate it.
It was much nicer than speaking to an empty room. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.